against much evidence to the contrary, this recap of our recent Star Trek Adventures episode, number 3 in our campaign to know the unknown, it has every chance of being short. But I'm sure my own nature will war against that. We'll see what happens. Now this episode, the third, as I said, was called Crew Exchange. And right up to the point where I started the first session of this episode, we had 2 sessions. Right up until that point, I wasn't sure which of 2 competing ideas I was going to use as the launching point of the episode. This decision, not exactly decision, more like instinct, was occupying, the back of my mind as we're getting the room ready to play, getting the character sheets out, putting the threat tokens where I can reach them, putting the momentum tokens where they can reach them. And as I stand up to launch the session and describe our typical North American family getting ready to watch television on a Thursday night, it was then that I knew. And the very first piece of information I gave them was the episode title. And this is in contrast to the last episode, the episode number 2, where they didn't get the episode title until we had finished play. And so the very first thing they see, or the very first thing I describe, the very first thing I say is the episode title, which is Crew Exchange. And this had a distinct effect on what I think players expected, of course, and how that episode felt. The episode itself really was all about a crew exchange. The vessel that they had rescued in the previous episode was traveling with them to a disaster zone. The crew of the USS Crow, of course, were lending a hand, not only because that's the kind of people that they are, but because this furthers their mission of extending diplomatic relations into the Beta Quadrant. So, this episode is a way for us to get to know each other, spend a little bit more time with the ship and our own crew, and see who they are in connection with a new alien species that isn't trying to escape or in some way gain advantage, that isn't trying to kill them, and isn't in danger. In play, all of the events were not out of sequence. They all followed the same timeline, but our perspective on events shifted from character to character and ship to ship. This was primarily a way to ensure that everyone was given an opportunity to be engaging with those events with their main character, and not only or always with secondary characters, but also as a way to keep tension higher in what was going to be primarily a social episode. So although events in play happened with a shifting perspective, for this recap, I'm going to follow these threads through to their conclusion with one character, because I think that might be easier to follow. While we're taking time to clarify how this recap is going to go, it's time to talk about the last recap briefly and say that a very important detail was missing from that recap. And that detail was about the mysterious signal that the USS Crow had detected from the 2 ships in distress, and they were assuming it was a distress signal. And when they tried to get information from their Aquan prisoners about the signal, at least to see if they could understand the language or not, again they received this sort of confirmation that it was a distress signal. But what I forgot, or actually what I accidentally edited out of the recap, was that it wasn't a distress signal. They had discovered later in the episode it wasn't a distress signal at all. It was a warning. The type of people that the Bediviri are, they didn't want anyone else to imperil themselves in this situation. They saw the situation as being so desperate, so near hopeless, that no one should risk their lives to come in to try and save them. They would either save themselves or they would perish. Do not approach was the signal. But the Aquans being the Aquans, and the Universal Translator issue being what it is, there was simply no way that the Aquans were going to come out and say, hey, these people, it's a warning. There's no way they're going to admit it's just a warning about ships in distress and not a distress signal. So that was very important. Now the players are well aware of this detail, and as they continue through this episode, this is how they're approaching the Bedivere culture. But for those following along in just the recaps, then some of what gets revealed in this won't make sense without knowing that very important detail. Let's get down to it. The first scene is of transporter room number 1, which is on our deck 9. The opening credits and the narration of Space, the Final Frontier, would come later. So we fade in from black, see crew exchange, and focus in on transporter room 1. Our ops manager, Bishop, is manning the transporter console. Transporter Chief Simmons is not in the scene. Our doctor is there. Of course, the executive officer is there, and our chief of security, as well as a 2-person security honor guard. The captain is conspicuously absent, and so our XO will receive the person with whom he is conducting this exchange and then himself journey over to the other ship. For fun and verisimilitude, our typical North American family is still in the kitchen. They can hear the episode, but they can't see it because they've been having trouble getting their pizza pockets ready. But fortunately, Dad comes to the rescue. He goes into the fridge and gets some kind of weird fruit beverage with some kind of exotic name, and then they all trundle in to watch the episode. And as soon as Dad recognizes that the captain, who he has a secret crush on, is not in the scene, he's kind of disappointed. But then the alien executive officer appears, and he changes his mind. This is an exchange of the 2 executive officers. Of course, Marcus Duvall has been the XO since this mission was launched. His counterpart is a newly promoted executive officer, as many of the bridge crew of the alien vessel had lost their lives during the events of the previous episode. So it's with some anticipation that they await this newly minted exec from the alien vessel. We'll deal with the experience of Lieutenant Duvall first, and the experience of Lieutenant Duvall on the alien vessel was fraught with peril. However, we didn't really get to explore that peril as much as I had hoped. The way that the entire episode played out across the 2 sessions, well, we ended up focusing on other things. But fortunately for us, the way this game works, Lawrence, the player of Lieutenant Duvall, was able to step into the shoes of a variety of secondary characters very quickly and easily, and play them very ably and entertainingly. So that was all right. But what happened to Lieutenant Duvall on the alien vessel? The first scene was sickbay. He was advised that he needed to go to make sure he was properly inoculated against things he might encounter. The doctor aboard the Bedivere vessel is portrayed as an older gentleman with a slight capricious side, and he very gleefully lays out the 2 choices. If Marcus steps away from the idea of the inoculation, he runs a slight risk of encountering what the Bedivere are calling childhood diseases. But if he doesn't embrace the inoculation, then he runs the risk of high fever, possible hallucination. So at the outset of this scene in sickbay, it seems like it would be a good idea to step away from getting this vaccination, because how can he put on, a proper example of a Starfleet officer if he's hallucinating on the bridge or wherever? But as the doctor detects this kind of hesitance to take the shot, he then gleefully goes on to explain that according to his analysis of the medical records from the Crow, that as a betazoid, one of the risks he might take if he were to catch one of these childhood diseases would be sterilization. And recognizing that he might someday want to have children, he rolls up his sleeve and give me the shot. So that set the tone of humor at the beginning of the episode. Now, sticking with Marcus, which we did not do in play, Marcus has his orientation session aboard the ship and meets some of the surviving crew members from the previous episode. Through his interactions with them, we get our first real taste of the Bedivere culture. We see some of their design principles in greater detail. Things like their doors mirror their eyes, so they open both vertically and horizontally with a great deal of speed. So we can just picture this, and for every door. What an expensive episode this would be. Then we cut to Marcus in his quarters, kind of asleep and troubled. This is the next night after a very busy day aboard the Bedivere vessel. He's obviously having a nightmare, and here we're drawing very heavily on original series themes as we talk about the pin light across his eyes, and he wakes up still in the grip of this nightmare, and he's certain that someone is coming to get him. Now, he's become aware during his orientation sessions that conflict as a method of determining the validity of an argument is very important to this species. I don't mean physical conflict. I don't mean they break out into wrestling matches every time they disagree. But spirited discourse and debate is where things begin. Speaking without support, without proof, and without the willingness to back up what you're saying is very problematic among these people. And there are lots of challenges to authority with a great deal of respect. Almost every situation could somehow become a tournament of sorts, a challenge to determine who will determine outcomes. Shifts in rank, therefore, could be theorized to be fluid and frequent. This is not something that we get to see, but in his mind, he's picturing a group of Bedivere officers coming to take his position. He's not fit for the role. He is an interesting challenge and one to be overcome. And so in the grip of hallucination, and with the power of telepathy behind him, he has access to the thoughts all around him, and they are distorted and swirled into a mess. And so we have this scene of a crew of officers coming to get to know him better, and this is completely misinterpreted. And so as they open the door to his crew quarters, they are met with him hiding behind a seat that he's overturned for cover with his phaser leveled at them, demanding that they forget about it and walk away. This was a very interesting opportunity to play out. It was manifested, of course, via the use of threat, but I didn't spend a lot of threat. I didn't want to turn it into, this is a terrible situation that you have to face, and turn it into something like the Divided Kirk episode where he's running around with only his violent side showing. What I wanted to do here was create a situation that the character would be aware of distantly and need to work his way through. So we represented that by spending a little threat on my side, allowing the player, of course, to spend momentum on their side if they wanted, and try to communicate is really what this was about. Communicate in the grips of this hallucination. Recognize the problem. So fortunately for him, he has an interesting set of talents, not the least of which is diffuse the tension. And so even though he himself is instigating violence, on the other side, the alien crew was interpreted as recognizing that there's a problem and wanting to help. Mechanically, this was very easy to represent. Here we have a social problem. There's a failure to communicate, and we've got Marcus behind this overturned piece of furniture leveling his phaser during the normal operations of the alien ship and saying, "I know why you've come." Back away. So what we were doing was dealing with, he's operating under this delusion. They're not. Right? But he has a tremendous difficulty understanding what's going on. So all of this social interaction had its difficulty raised. And by instigating this with a threat spend to change the scene trait to one of paranoia, he now has to deal with this paranoia. How will he deal with it? Well, that's left entirely to the player. Will he try to create some kind of advantage? Will he kind of press through it, hoping that his condition will become obvious and gain the sympathy or the empathy of the people who he is afflicting his paranoia upon? And that was very entertaining to see play out. And it was very easy and quick to resolve, with the ability to buy extra dice to deal with the raising difficulties as things shift, and to win over the crew, or at least gain their confidence long enough for a solution to be found. But where the player was really interesting is how focused they were on regaining their senses, their awareness, their individual sense that something was wrong. Not to get help and be treated, but to develop an awareness that this was the side effect that they had been warned of, and they had to get themselves to sickbay. So I really liked how that played out, and gave us a very strong sense of an independent, well-trained, disciplined officer who, even in the grip of mental delusions and hallucinations, has this strong sense of duty, which made, in my mind, a very strong impression on the Betty Veary that he was living among at the time. So they disperse as he requests with his leveled phaser. They leave him alone for a minute, and he begins to notice that something's not right. And if something's not right, what must it be? And following the logic chain through, he recognizes that it must be a reaction to the vaccine that he had received. He must be, processing his immune system must be working overtime, and he's hallucinating, so he needs to get to sickbay. He's very worried about getting to sickbay without harming anyone else. So next we have Marcus Duvall in sickbay dealing with the doctor and trust issues and the challenge issues that come along with that, all of which were very entertaining. Aboard the Crow, our points of view were split mainly between our ops manager, Bishop, and the Vulcan Chief of Security, Topora. So, going back to scene number 1, these two crew members are also with us in Transporter Room 1 as our alien executive officer. A Sub-Lieutenant Marks is beamed aboard. And this was our first point of confusion, because she bore the same name as the male Betty Veary Sub-Lieutenant Marks, who was the exo in the previous session who had perished. This point of confusion resolved around the ongoing universal translator issues. I'm trying to portray their languages and culture as being different enough that the universal translator is providing less than perfect translations, providing adequate translation only. The idea that a program, when it gets confused, might rely on earlier or more buried prompts of information to its human operators. Meaning, sometimes the universal translator for us will dip into myth, legend, folklore, fiction, this sort of thing, to try and get its concepts across. One of the Next Generation episodes that I really, really liked is the one featuring Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra. But with all of that working, we don't want to get tied up too much in communication difficulties. We just want communication to be a feature of being in this entirely new place among entirely new cultures. That's one of the ways I feel that I can quickly portray this difference. So we're not really sure who this woman is in relation to the other Sub-Lieutenant Marks, is my point. She describes herself at various points during the episode as his contract partner, his life partner, and it is until much later in the second session of the episode that the Universal Translator has had enough exposure to the culture through Marcus's comm badge and through the interactions with this Sub-Lieutenant Marks that it finally supplies the right kind of translation. That is, his wife. Just a simple thing, which interestingly was a point of confusion that resolved or emerged naturally from play. I had thought that something like contract partner or life partner would be an awkward sounding term to which they would supply the term wife, that they would recognize what this was about. But I guess the alien nature of new game and whatnot hid this point from us, and it wasn't until I supplied the word wife that people recognized, oh, they're married. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and it was a refreshing bit of realism to arise. Now, Sub-Lieutenant Marks wastes no time after she gets through her time in sickbay, which we don't pay any attention to because she's just an NPC, and we currently don't have anyone running the doctor. So we shift away from that. She's taken off to go to sickbay, and we're left focusing on Topora and Bishop, who are now off duty. And so they're on Deck 9, and the players know what's on Deck 9. Not only is Transporter Room number 1 there, not only are the VIP quarters there, not only are they just one deck away from sickbay, which is on Deck 10, the lounge is there. Our lounge faces rearward with the design of a Cheyenne-class starship. It gives us a unique opportunity to have a view out the rear of the ship, framed by the 4 nacelles, kind of like this image. And so this is our first view of this off-duty area. And while we get in there, Bishop and Topora start discussing this situation. And around them, there are crew members who are celebrating something, and they're getting quite boisterous and exuberant. But off in the corner, there are 2 Marines who are playing darts. Now, of course, this isn't real darts. It's a futuristic, holographic version. But it does allow for the use of skill and encourages competition. Since their introduction, the relationship between the Marines and the Chief of Security has been strained, particularly the relationship between Topora, our Chief of Security, and Carson Rogers, the CO of the Marines. Now, these are just 2 Marines off duty, but Topora starts watching them like a hawk, and tensions begin to flare a little bit between these celebrating normal crewmen and the Marines. Can you do any better? This kind of stuff, this kind of bravado. And rather see that play out and have the regular crewmen be destroyed at this harmless game of darts, Topora steps in. And we have a very interesting interplay. At a moment, it seems like we're going to have Topora facing them down, and she begins to critique their methodology. But around them, her display of friction, although she's, of course, a Vulcan and quite calm, but she's opened up this vent. And so the tension in the room increases. Bishop steps in to help diffuse the tension, and Topora realizes where things are going, and she dismisses the Marines, sends them on their way, and Bishop sends the other revelers on their way. nearly clearing the lounge. And then they're left there by the dartboard. And so they decide to have a game. In this challenge, we would expect Tapora to be able to win. It plays to her advantages. But Bishop is not without his tricks and not without his reserves of ability. And so this contest, although it seemed like a foregone conclusion, was a much better challenge than that. And the way that the challenge was represented was, again, using something along the lines of an extended task. Now, combat and extended tasks have a lot of things in common, and I thought, well, if we're going to have this dart contest, which I threw in the description of what the Marines were doing just off the top of my head, but now I'm left with having to have a system to resolve it. So I decided, well, I'm going to make it mostly like combat, but I'm going to throw in, rather than some kind of wound track or trying to keep an actual score like dart scoring would do, I'll just quickly improvise a work track, right? This is what you need to do. So we figured we would need 11 units of work, 2 breakthroughs. The 11th unit of work would count as a breakthrough. So really we're looking at 10 units of work. You need to get 2 breakthroughs to complete the task and 1 work beyond that. So it's entirely possible to do this in 2 or 3 rolls, which would give us enough space for the characters to, dig into their resources, to generate some momentum, to change results, or to let it ride and see what they could do with just raw skill. There was enough room for that. Now, theoretically, 2 breakthroughs, it's not a lot. So this shouldn't take too much time, but it should take enough time to feel worthwhile. And the 2 players are husband and wife. The 2 characters have only recently started to be associated in the same, duty roster. So it's kind of interesting to see this interplay. Who's going to win and whatnot. And there's lots of great banter that stayed within the realms of Star Trek. Having the Marines on board as a disruptive influence, as we talked about before, not that they're behaving badly, but that they are expressly military in a crew that has not fully accepted the fact that they're on a mostly military mission, right? They're trying to bring the best of Starfleet forward, even though they recognize that out here they are facing a lot of dangers, particularly with their mission focus on the Romulans. So there's this internal conflict, and that is externalized as this friction with the Marines. So all of these things come together in this dart game. Now, in the background, what this lets me do is get to practice with the players a little bit of how combat works. So if combat should come around by surprise or by design at the beginning of a scenario, we'll be ready for it. So, who wins? Bishop surprised us quite a bit with a very strong lead. He ended up with 4 of the work track. He'd done 4 damage and was pretty close to getting a breakthrough on that first roll. Tapora comes out with more. She's a little bit ahead, but not as far ahead as she could have been. But she gets one of her breakthroughs. Then that kind of kicks Bishop into gear, and he goes all out trying to do so, and he does. He closes the gap and passes, right? And he gets in range where he can easily win the game next time, unless Tapora really digs in also and chooses to focus on beating him. And that was the interesting decision that I like to see emerge from this experience. Does our player, playing a Vulcan, how is this expressed? So that was an interesting bit of character exploration. And now the tone of this entire episode is really starting to become a reality. Something that I had hoped for was starting to happen. It was time at this point in our series to try and do what's called a spotlight episode, which is related to the experience system. If characters are challenged significantly during the course of play, such as in an episode, then they have the opportunity to improve, or at least change the character through the milestone system. And most often you're going to see the normal milestone. But there are also spotlight milestones, which should come around every few episodes, where one particular character, the way things go, stands out. This is left in the hands of the group to identify which character should receive the spotlight. But it was at this point that I'm recognizing that this really should be a spotlight episode for everybody. In other words, a spotlight not on the situation, not on events, not on the general crew, not on a rescue, not on the alienness of this quadrant, but instead on our three principal characters. Who are they as people? If you put Marcus Duvall in a tough situation, what is he going to show us? If you challenge Topora in her sphere of influence, what is she going to show us? And likewise, if you challenge Bishop, what is he going to show us? So with this realization that the episode might go in this direction, although, the way that we play, there's no guarantee that what an episode seems like it will actually be what it will be. The title of the episode, Crew Exchange, has now in my head taken on additional meaning. Not only is it the exchange of Marks and Duvall, there are crew exchanges between the crew. And I kind of like that idea. It's a little bit of synchronicity. At this stage of the first session, things begin to accelerate. The scenes become shorter and more pointed and focused on very specific things. This is partly my intent to help bring this idea out that I have seen and allow the characters to show what they can do. But also, we've noticed this effect each time we've played. The first hour is quite slow, stately pace, like starships in space, and in the last 30 minutes, things accelerate a lot. It's an interesting feel. I'm not sure yet that I like it or want it to have this feel all the time, and we'll talk about that when we get to the next episode. But once this scene in the lounge is over, then it's time to report for the formal welcoming dinner, where the captain will finally make her appearance and meet the new XO. And that scene goes very smoothly. It's all roleplay. Then we transfer to the bridge, where we have Sub-Lieutenant Marks meeting all the bridge officers in a work context, not in a social context, and beginning to work. And she's having a very specific effect right away. Instead of maybe the high level of politeness, the high level of teamwork and interaction that we're used to, whereas if Lieutenant Duvall is not quite satisfied with what Science Officer Pox has put forward as a theory, then he will step in, lend his assistance, and direct things in a way that is more to his liking. Teaching, guiding, helping, assisting, all of these things. A nurturing kind of environment. And we can do all of these things with game mechanics. The way that a commanding officer character works in the game, the tools that they're given, allows you to bring this out really easily. It really does model the Starfleet model that we see in the prime crews on the TV shows. This Sub-Lieutenant Marks doesn't work that way. She expects a certain level of result. If she doesn't get it, she challenges for improvement or asks if anybody else can do it better. And so this sets up some interesting dynamics where people are made to feel uncomfortable. They're still getting their results, but there's an alien presence on board who's interacting differently. So they explain and receive an explanation. Everybody's listening to everybody, as you'd expect in a Starfleet crew. And we end up having an episode that is focused very much on the social dynamics of our 24th century crew. We're having a Star Trek episode, one that's about Star Trek culture, which I think is fascinating. It's one of those episodes where nothing's really happening, and yet things of very significant import for character, for setting, and for us as people are taking place in dialogue and interaction. So one of the last scenes of the episode moves everything back to the lounge, where we find Sub-Lieutenant Marks serving as the exo, working with all these data pads, reviewing all of the crew reports and asking very pointed questions to Bishop and to Pora. And some of the people that are being asked about are actually in the room. She doesn't think there's any reason why this should be a private conversation about their performance. This is how their reputation is framed. Everybody knows that they can do these things. How well do they do these things? Very, very odd situation. And again, this previous conversation from the bridge is continued. But what it establishes is that she demands the same standard of excellence that Starfleet does, but has a completely different way to come about it. And are the members of our crew willing to accept she might have a point in some areas? Is there a place where they can learn from this other culture, a culture which technologically is a century behind them? But that doesn't really mean that socially they are as well. Interesting stuff. And so the scene that's set up is she's not happy with a report that has been dealt with from Science Officer Pox. And that is the report from the previous episode about the potential contact with a cloaked vessel. Not enough has been done, she feels, to resolve whether it was or was not a cloaked vessel, if there was or was not a problem with the sensors, if there was or was not a problem with procedures, this sort of thing. Was your attention divided? Is there a fault or flaw with the mechanics? And so this makes Bishop uncomfortable enough that even though he's worked 2 shifts back to back, he accepts an order from this alien exo to do a major system diagnostic of the hardware. So we then cut to crawling through Jeffries tubes with his aide, who we've named Jeffries for that express reason. If someone in Starfleet, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. So Bishop and Jeffries are crawling through Jeffries tubes, seeking out proof, one way or the other, about the sensors and their condition. And Bishop has some phenomenal roles when it comes to engineering. Not just is he able to marshal a lot of good resources to enable him to do his job, but he manages to roll ones, which is the best you can possibly roll, often enough and in duplicate numbers that he can get some incredible results. And so he winds up pulling out very directly, like through the use of momentum, through the use of beating a high difficulty, and with the help of the right tools and the right helper, he's able to generate the sort of roll results that allow him to penetrate right to the heart of the matter, because he's a highly trained Starfleet officer. This is what you're playing. You're not playing a game where characters are going to slowly improve over time and become heroes. You're starting right out of the gate with a very, very competent individual who might change their focus from time to time, might shift their specialties from time to time, but are essentially going to remain highly competent all the way through the campaign. And so he pulls this small little clue out of the ether. No other crew would have found it, this kind of thing. This is a very heroic moment. And he has proof positive that they did have an encounter with a ship, that they were lucky to have made any kind of sensor contact at all, just because of the conditions, dust conditions that they were passing through at the time, and that it's very likely an older Romulan model design inspired by Klingon designs. He has a lot of information to then present. He can use that information to support the findings by Science Officer Pox, teach her something new, or teach Pox something new about the sensor operations of the Crow, and do what Lieutenant Marks wants. Quite impressive, bolstering Bishop's reputation in the crew, and definitely a spotlight moment. So these are the 3 specific moments focusing on our crew members. We have Marcus Duval and his reaction to his medical emergency aboard the alien vessel, and his capacity to communicate with all of those people despite this handicap of his medical emergency of hallucinating and high fever and paranoia, and still learn a lot about their culture and encourage them to treat him with respect, to recognize his competence. We have T'Pora, who embraces proper technique, proper tradition, who is all about doing things the right way in a situation where things are not going properly, but having to explain. Frequently, she's the one called upon to explain to Sub-Lieutenant Marks the nature of Starfleet, the nature of the emotional beings around them, the environment or the methodology of Starfleet, and so on and so forth. She becomes the voice of the culture of the ship. And then we have Bishop, with a history of being a rebel, a history of bucking against the military aspects or the rank and file aspects of Starfleet, embracing its best and brightest concepts. So this brings us to the end of the first session, and it also, interestingly, brings us to the separate activities of our principal characters. That doesn't exactly include Marcus Duval, who spends the entirety of the episode on the alien vessel until the very, very end. But for all intents and purposes, we will now move into the events of the second session, but describe them as a unified effort. Because thanks to the comm badges and the high level of communication available to these 2 ships as they're traveling together, it's just like you're there, even when you're not. In keeping with tradition, the second session opens up after the major commercial break, and we make some jokes about Hamburger Helper and Tang, I think, this time, and then we get into the episode. And as I mentioned earlier, the session starts out at a slower pace and then gradually picks up as we move toward the end of our time. So this session actually opens up with a meeting between the alien XO, Sub-Lieutenant Marks, and T'Pora. And this is our sense of how this alien XO is meeting with all the primary members of the crew. And this happens to be T'Pora's meeting. And they are discussing Carson Rogers and the Marine problem. And Marks is suggesting to T'Pora a strategy that she thinks will work if she would only consider it. Now, whether or not T'Pora will consider the strategy did not factor into this episode at all. But Marks felt that she really needed to demonstrate to Rogers her not only ability to lead, but her right to lead. Although she's lower ranked and of less experience and not as focused on the military aspects of Starfleet as Rogers is, she has every right and all the abilities she needs to be responsible not only for acting as the liaison between the Marines and the rest of the crew, but she deserves to be in charge of that unit. That was an interesting conversation. This took us back to the bridge and more interactions with officers who've had their feathers ruffled, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way, by our new alien XO. We've since learned that Marcus Duval has had his problems and is handling them well and is in sickbay, and he's communicating back and forth as we have our meeting, where the captain comes forward and takes the sensor logs that Bishop has uncovered, recognizes formally that yes, there does seem to be enough evidence to suggest they're being pursued by a Romulan, what they call Warbird, and that the crew will need to be ready for it. Further, she commends Bishop and she commends Duval for their devotion to duty, And she spends special attention talking to Bishop, who's right there in the room with her, and how thankful she was that he had worked 3 shifts, and she sends him off duty. Now, in the background of everything that we've talked about so far, we've had Lawrence, whose main character is Marcus Duvall, playing a lot of secondary characters as needed, such as Science Officer Pox, such as the Captain. And so now we've got Bishop sent off, and we have Marcus in sickbay. So now we've got potentially 2 people to bring in other crew members as needed. And what happens is that taking all of this information, taking the captain's directive to be alert and aware, they finally enter in to the solar system where this disaster has occurred. And the Bediverians have been filling them in not only on this system, but on the systems surrounding it and how their council, their version of the Federation, works. They have no known contacts with any kind of species that uses cloaking technology. They've had some contact with species that the Federation has contact with, but you know, their knowledge of the Romulans is nothing. So for them, to their mind, all this is a natural disaster. For some reason, a collision with a large solar body, some kind of large asteroid, was able to happen, and it caused widespread devastation on this world. We spent some time delving into the culture of the world, all the things that had been lost, all the rescue attempts which were already underway, that sort of thing. And there were some other alien ships associated with the Bediveri now in orbit because of the delay that had happened with the previous episode and the trinary black hole. So rescue efforts are on the way, and the crew of the Crow and all the assistance that they can bring are welcomed. But as they move their way into the system, they start analyzing all the data, and they wonder, how is it possible with this system set up this way for this disaster to have occurred at all? And then our very alert crew, looking for cloaked Romulan vessels, notice another massive smart rock on its way to a collision course with the planet. And we call it a smart rock because it shouldn't be on this trajectory. It shouldn't be traveling at this speed. It's obviously under some kind of guidance. So we send the Crow on a course to intercept, and we begin collecting data and figuring out plans. And the plan that the crew likes the most is the idea of causing a deflection point. The object itself is too large to destroy, so it needs to be deflected. It's too large to tractor, etc., etc. The only thing that they can do is, at the right place in time, create enough energy to push it off course. Can they do it? Calculations begin. What if they were to modify the quantum torpedoes, and this goes? Under the dual guidance of Marcus Duvall from sickbay and Sub-Lieutenant Marks on scene, the captain is involved with the science and so on and so forth, and we begin to generate massive results. And very little time is left to act. The crew acts using this temporary modification of the quantum torpedoes. They are able to deflect the asteroid just enough. Now, it will still cause storms and other kinds of disaster across the surface of the planet, but it will not impact with the planet. It will not strip away its atmosphere or any other of the horrible effects that could have happened. The crew are heroes. They've saved the day. And there's more. As they continue to figure out how this asteroid could possibly have been here in the first place, doing what it's doing, they discover the remains of technology on its rear surface. They quickly are able to determine its Romulan in origin, and it represents a significant investment of resources. It had a device not unlike a cloaking device, which would help to shield the rock from detection, and it had motive thrusters. So from somewhere far out in the system, the rock was gradually moved, encouraged to accelerate up to its present speed, and it was able to shield itself from detection efforts. So coming in high above the ecliptic, where people aren't as likely to look anyway, all allowed this thing to happen. definitive proof has now been obtained that the Romulans are here and the Romulans are interfering with these cultures. Their purpose for causing this widespread disaster is uncertain, but one thing that they do know is that there are resources on that planet which the Romulans desperately need. So we've seen signs of different kinds of mineral ore on different worlds that the Romulans have arranged to put themselves in a position to collect. And this is one more world that they're trying to set up for easy harvest with their slave trade economy. So our representatives go before the representatives of the Bedivere Council, and they make their case for alertness and action against the Romulan Empire and extend an olive branch of friendship from the Federation. This is a major accomplishment. And so ends the episode. So, with an episode like this, the idea of rank, reputation, and possible promotion is definitely on the table. And we know that our captain was kind of looking for retirement and forced to remain in service because of a severe lack of Starfleet personnel as the result of all the preceding years of war and loss. So we end up with the reputation system providing a really interesting reflection of the events. What you do as the Game Master is you identify positive and negative influences on reputation. And as reputation increases, you earn the possibility of promotion. Or you can refuse promotion and continue to accrue reputation, giving yourself a buffer, lots of respect and trust among the crew that you work with. So we could have long-serving lieutenants who are among the best lieutenants in Starfleet or the best executive officers or so on and so forth. Or we could have people advancing at a fast pace, trying to get up to the upper limits, perhaps a captaincy of their own. I like this quite a bit. So at the end of the episode, when all the smoke had cleared, we recognized that T'Pora was known to be creating some of her own problems, her inability to quite mesh with all of her responsibilities, namely figure out a way to keep the Marines in check and make people feel comfortable. That serves as a negative influence. However, everything else she does, her high level of competence, her protectiveness of the crew, her participation in designing the quantum torpedoes modification that would go on to save this planet, all of these things contribute positively to her reputation. And so she's inching her way toward a promotion. She's just one step away, or 1 point away, from where she would qualify for that. Likewise, Bishop. Bishop had no negative strikes against him in this episode and had a lot of positives, and so he jumped ahead, again, closing in on the next opportunity for promotion. Marcus Duvall, however, did achieve promotion. He acquitted himself extremely well under trying circumstances and was an exemplary officer, as we've noted before, and so has been promoted from lieutenant to lieutenant commander. So this puts him much closer to the rank of the captain, who is only at this time a commander. Lots of interesting things ahead, lots of interesting social interactions ahead, and we'll look forward to seeing what they turn into. Now, at the point of the recording of this recap, we've played the first session of the next episode, and I look forward to talking to you about it in the future. But for now, this video is much longer than I ever expected it would be, and I only have myself to blame. Until next time, take care, and thanks for watching.